My name is Ryder, and I'll be answering a question trapped in time. What ethical judgments were made to justify oppression in Canada?
In 1876, the Canadian government passed a number of laws called the Indian Act, which was said to help Canadian expansion. The consequences of this act, however, were led by a series of events that resulted in an attempted extinction of a culture. This was also the start of the darkest days in Canadian history. As well as a proclamation to enlarge the area settlers could live, the other priority of the Indian Act was to assimilate all First Peoples. They did this by separating the First Nations from their culture any which way possible. Some of the primary actions were banning all spiritual or cultural festivities. An example of this would be the potlatch law, created in 1871. The law induced all potlatch ceremonies would be illegal under the Canadian government's ruling that any expression or rendition of this important gift-giving ceremony, if held, would result in severe punishment. Although First Nations communities would still find ways to partake in this momentous ceremony, such as disguising the events as Christian holidays, the ban of cultural events oppressed that generation and ripped apart the culture of First Peoples to an extent never seen earlier in Canadian contact of history. In the midst of all that, a system called the treaty system was introduced. The system made it so that every time a settler was going to settle on land where First Nations resided, they would have to create a treaty. A treaty is a declaration of exchange rights that the land inhabitant, First Nations peoples, and the settler would have to sign in one's land. The treaty would often consist of a list of exchanges between the two, such as wealth or sophisticated rights. Between 1871 and 1921, the 11 different treaties with First Peoples. Although the treaties resulted in different outcomes for both sides of the deals, negotiation between each one were often translated by British officials. Since the First Nations could only speak and not read the English language at the time, it was said that the British had a biased influence on treaties. This often resulted in little or no benefits for the First Nations and grand benefits for the Canadian government. During the treaty system, a new idea was approved in the Canadian government. This idea would be the main cause in today's oppression in Canada. Since the government would still yearn for full assimilation of the First Peoples of Canada, the idea of a boarding school that would segregate First Nations children from their parents and culture was vividly praised. Although the first school opened in early 1800s, the residential school system was most recognized to take place from 1870 all the way to when the last school was closed in 1996. Although the schools were often funded by the government, oftentimes people running them were part of the church. In these schools, church children were taught to be ashamed and embarrassed of their culture. They were also ruled that they were not allowed to speak their language. If a child was caught doing this, severe punishments occurred. Kids as young as 4 years old were sent to these schools. Parents protested this idea, but they were ignored for doing so. Out of the thousands of children that were sent, almost none left without severe lifelong trauma. In the course of the more than 100 years of residential schools, it was said that nearly 6,000 First Nations children did not make it back home. A quote from Chief Dan George, a great chief in British Columbia, Tsleil-Waututh and the First Nations. When I fought to protect my land and home, I was called a savage. When I neighboring understood or welcome the white man's life, I was called lazy. When I tried to rule my people, I was stripped of my authority. After many years of unforsaken trauma and pain the First Peoples of Canada had dealt with, the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. Although First Nation culture is still present today, the oppression that Canada's past nationalism ensued can never be justified. This is a dark and crooked path to look back on, though it is more than important to learn what people did wrong and what humanity can do to make things right for the future. In 2008, the Government of Canada made its first official apology to the First Nations people. Modern-day aid helps First Nation culture as well as the mental health of the people to heal. Organizations such as the TRC, which strive to help reconciliation and strengthen the understandings and respect for both First Nation and non-First Nations communities, were made. Our question for this project was, what ethical judgments were made to justify oppression in Canada? I have answered this with the Canadian government only wanted to colonize and settle. In their eyes, the First Peoples and Métis were seen as obstacles in their path. The government's nationalism caused justification for anything and all that would do to get rid of their obstacle and complete the goal of colonizing the entire country. This common goal dates back to the forceful spread of Christianity centuries prior. Thank you for watching.